Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again. Oh, sorry about that. Technical difficulties, everyone. I forgot to take loop off. That's my bad. But anyways, thank you everyone for joining us. This is a sorry. Can we just appreciate the live for a second? I just want to appreciate this moment. Anyways, okay. So welcome everyone to another episode of We Are Being Transformed. This is a very special live episode, a discussion with two great content creators that I admire greatly. If you are new to We Are Being Transformed, this is a show where we explore the liminal spaces and contours of reality, the myriad of ways people interact with their world through the vehicles of ritual, cult, and lore. And before we bring on the scholar of the hour, the alchemical governor himself, Dr. Justin Sledge, I am going to bring on my co host for this very special episode. She is the host of Rejected Religion, a podcast that I greatly enjoy. Fantastic interviews with scholars and uh, contemporary occult issues, and everybody should check that out. So joining me is the one, the only Stephanie Shea. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I'm very, very happy to be here today. Really
Welcome. Yeah,
excited.
I apologize for the loop. I always
No
try to
problem.
turn that off, but unfortunately, no. It's really funny because Stephanie and I worked really hard to make sure all the technical issues were taken care of before, and somehow I'm the one who messed that up. So mea culpa, my bad. Stephanie,
It's okay. It's okay. We work it out.
right. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for being on the show. I really love your show. Just
Thank you.
the interviews you have are super top notch. You've interviewed everybody from, Wouter Honoraff to Dylan Burns to Korshi Dosu, and some of my personal favorites, the with Brennan Cattell on Lilith, as we were talking about. So, Stephanie, you say that your show covers a culture. So I didn't know if you could just explain briefly what your show is about, and what you mean by a culture.
Okay, sure. I'll try to do this. Sometimes I find it sometimes difficult to explain what it is that I actually do to people because it's such a broad thing. But a culture is a word. It's actually a combination of two words. I call it the portmanteau of occult and culture. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the term was coined by Genesis Peorage, and then kind of taken over by the scholar Christopher Partridge. I believe his first name is Christopher, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea behind a culture is that there basically a culture is everywhere. The occult is everywhere in culture. Everywhere you look, you will find it. And sometimes we don't recognize it on first glance if we don't know what it is that we're looking at. But once we become more and more familiar with occult symbols, occult themes, motifs, et cetera, then you'll start to realize, yeah, it is basically everywhere that you look.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big reason why I got into religious studies, New Testament studies, things like that. Just I was a big fan when I was a teenage edgelord of bands like The Mission and the Sisters of Mercy, and I was Fields of the Nephilim we're talking about today, and I was like,
Yeah.
Wayne from The Mission has a lot of really religious tinged
Mm.
lyrics. So like I was always into that Dungeons and Dragons and uh, deification stuff he was kind of doing with this music, and it kind of got me into like I'm like, oh, New Testament and all this stuff, all this flowery language. It's like poetry, but like in a people take it much more seriously. But Stephanie, you also have a website. Tell us a little bit about the website and your social media. Where can people find you?
Right. It's the website is www.rejectedreligion.com, And that basically is the platform. All of my social media is also Rejected Religion. Um, Basically, the platform functions as kind of like the little hub where all the information is put out about stuff that I'm doing, interviews that I'm going to be giving or holding, I guess I should say, uh, and other projects that I'm working on, other just other things that are happening within the community. If there are things happening, then I'll post links to exhibitions, etc. I also work in collaboration with the University of Amsterdam, the faculty of history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents, in their communications, the kind of media team. So anything that's happening, lectures at the university or outside of the university in other areas, I try to also share that type of information as well. And also just for fun, sometimes I just curate things that I find and I think that might be interesting. So yeah, it's more of a trying to keep in touch with people in the community. And I also have a blog post, a blog that I sometimes post on. I'm not really the best on posting longer blogs, but I am working on trying to get a little bit better in posting blogs. So hopefully those will be coming soon.
Excellent. Well, everybody check those out. If you're watching now, if you're watching later, in fact, unsubscribe from me and go subscribe to Rejected Religion. No, I'm kidding. But
No, don't do that.
no, Stephanie, I just really want to emphasize that I really do appreciate the work that you do. People like you, like Justin, like Earl at the Schwepp. Without the
Right.
roadmaps that you
Yeah.
provide, it really is a service. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your interest, and this is something that I really enjoy doing. My intention was to try to act as a bridge between the academic sphere and the mainstream media or mainstream public, in that everything that's out there. I know that there are a lot of other people doing the same thing, and I think every one of us are doing our own little put our own little twist on things. And I think it's great that there is such a really fabulous community of people who are trying to help educate and just share things and just have fun.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. So whether you're a dude on the couch like me or Stephanie and Justin, educators, just feel free to get involved. Everybody's voice is important. That's what dynamic
Right.
cultural exchange is about, right?
Exactly.
So Stephanie, we're talking Watchers, Nephilim, all that really fun stuff today.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we have a guest who probably needs no introduction, but if you'd like to introduce him, please feel free.
Well, our the next person we're bringing up, I'm not really I'm really bad at live shows. I'm finding out right at this moment. I'm not
Oh no,
very
it's
well
part of the
versed
fun.
about
It's part of the
this
fun,
stuff.
right? It's part of the fun.
Okay, well, I'm gonna try to do my best. We have Dr. Justin Sledge of the Esoterica channel.
Hey y'all.
Welcome.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all
Welcome.
so much.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Stephanie, for the work that you do. I really admire the work you do as well, both of you. So yeah, it's great to be in this
Thanks.
ecosystem, right? That we
Exactly.
yeah, it's just a really fantastic thing. So thank you so much for having me on to talk about the perennially interesting Nephilim. I of all the things that seems to fire people's imagination, the Nephilim, and to a lesser extent the Rephaim, really seem to inspire people for whatever reason, from video games to to a culture to conspiracy theory. So it's a really interesting thing. You'd be surprised how many comments I get about the Nephilim and how someone found a giant skeleton in Turkey. What do you think about that? And I'm like,
Yes.
that
Yes.
didn't happen, but that's interesting. um, but I appreciate the fact, Jason, that you are the perfect host wearing the Boy Harsher shirt. So between your Boy Harsher shirt and my Solace shirt,
Yeah. I
Um,
wanted to mention that. I didn't see that
those
before until
we get
you
those
went
extra
live.
points.
just like
I was trying to decide what shirt to wear. So I like to rep my scholars. I like to rep my bands. So I was like, should I wear Justin's shirt? Maybe, but then I remember I did that where we recorded a video with Justin one time, and I'm like, I don't know, you shouldn't really wear the shirt of
it's
like when you
it's
go see a band and you're not wearing the shirt, you shouldn't
it's the
wear
metal
the shirt
etiquette
of the
thing, right?
band.
Do you
Yeah,
wear the shirt of the band of the show you're going to see? This is an
yes,
interesting philosophical question. I really, this is a kind of aesthetic question that I would spend a lot of time on that I shouldn't, but I think it is an interesting kind of thing. But yeah, I'm really glad to be on and to talk about the huge amount of literature. I mean, people forget that the Nephilim, as far as mythological entities, I would say maybe I wouldn't totally double down on this, but in terms of geographical distribution in the ancient world, I might argue that the Nephilim are the most widely distributed mythological unit in the ancient world. That is to say, you could read about if you were in 400 of the Common Era, you could read about the Nephilim in Spain, and you could also read about them in central China. That is really interesting. I don't think hardly any other creatures have that kind of geographical distribution in the ancient world. More people, in terms of geographical spread, would have known about the Nephilim than would have known about Yahweh or Jesus, perhaps, or angels and demons. It's amazing how far how far they travel. It's really weird to see the word Nephilim, a Hebrew word written in Chinese characters. That's a really interesting. That's
Amazing.
a really interesting for me. That is like a moment you're like, whoa. And so that's mind blowing to my mind as a person who's interested in this stuff.
yeah, Justin, it's really incredible. I'll admit that I'm not the most well versed in this. So when I saw Stephanie wanted to talk about the Book of Giants and Manichaeism in the same discussion, I was like, okay, I need to do some more research. So, but what I found was very interesting. You have, like you said, this very ubiquitous myth of the Nephilim, the Watchers, these giants. In the NRS view, it's translated as like hero. These are like heroes of old, right? In the Book of Giants, one of the giants is named Gilgamesh, right? It's really interesting. So like
In both the Qumran fragments and in the Manichaean fragments, Gilgamesh is listed. In fact, I think it's one of the last attestations of Lilith in literature. The
that's
last place
so
Gilgamesh appears the last place he occurs as a mythological character is in the Book of Giants. I think
yeah,
that's right.
that's so fascinating. And I just want to preface this, everyone, by stating that I'm not an expert in either of these um, subjects, but I am drawing most of what I took my notes on from the indispensable work of Jason Badoon on Manichaeism in his book, The Manichaean Body. And I am also taking it from Matthew Goff's incredible work on the Book of Giants. So check those out as well. I do
John
have some
Reeves,
links
yeah,
in the
John Reeves'
description.
work on the Book of Giants, I think, is some of the best. I think his maybe some of the definitive studies on the Book of Giants is John Reeves' book, which is surprisingly inexpensive
I'll add that.
considering academic publishing. It's a great
I'll have to add
text
that to
looking
the
at.
bibliography. Yeah, excellent, excellent. And also, I'll add that to the bibliography at the end. But yeah, it's like we have the Book of Giants, which is dependent on the Book of Watchers, which is found in First Enoch, right? So they're all dependent on each other. These were very popular texts. So Justin, I didn't know if you could kind of talk a little bit about this basic myth, what's kind of going on in them. Why do you think they're so endearing to people at this period of time?
So the main thing to say, right, is that this whole literature is stemming out of the verses in Genesis 6. They're 3 or 4 basically throwaway verses in Genesis 6, which I do love when that happens, when there are throwaway verses where they just like drop a bomb on you and move on as if nothing happened. This happens in the sagas too sometimes. They'll be like, and we went over here and then we did this and then we went over here and I borrowed a cow and then there were some trolls we fought with. And they're like, hold on, trolls? And they just move on as if that's completely within the wheelhouse of what's acceptable things that happen in the world. And I guess perhaps it was. So ditto with the book of Enoch, right? We have this whole throwaway verse in Genesis 6 where it seems like some creatures from the divine council seem to come down and mate with human women, spawn some kind of beings, and these beings existed. And there's a kind of continual reference back through the Hebrew Bible that that the Anakim or the other kinds of giant creatures, the Rephaim, are sort of melded with them, which are earlier Bronze Age beings. So that's the core of the myth. That's basically the core of the myth. Yeah, the heroes of old, warriors of renown. And so, what gets built out of that is really, really impressive. And there's a way of understating it, and there's a way of overstating it. And I'm going to overstate it to make a point. And to overstate it to make a point is that it seems as if there were two parallel kinds of Jewish theology operating sometime in the early period of the Second Temple. There's a kind of a Deuteronomistic theology, right? This is the idea that God has made a vassal contract. Yahweh made a vassal contract with the Israelites, and their job is to mediate basically with God through the temple sacrifices, right? And so that's the classic Deuteronomistic theology. I'll give you stuff, you'll give me stuff. There seems to have been a parallel Enochic theology, and this Enochic theology has much more to do with apocalypticism, has much more to do with the origins of evil, has much more to do with visionary things. It's less interested in the temple. In fact, they even use a different set of calendrical system. Famously, the Enochian calendrical system found there in the Book of Enoch toward the back is a solar calendar, as opposed to the lunar solar calendar that we find in. And what's interesting about this is that it seems to this is really was appealing to people. For instance, the Book of Jude famously quotes from the Book of Enoch. So we have it. We have the New Testament quoting from the Book of Enoch, but also people sometimes forget there are more copies of the Book of Enoch in the Book of the Watchers recovered from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, than there are copies of Leviticus. Like, right, there are more copies of that than than books of the Torah. That community was, and they followed the solar calendar as well, so they were out of sync with the rest of the Jewish world in terms of the observance of holidays. So they were very much interested in this kind of apocalyptic Enochic kind of interpretation of theology, of Judaism, one of the many Judaisms. And so this Enochic theology, which explains why evil exists in the world, it's the responsibility of these watchers. Although it's interesting that in the Manichaean version, it's women who seduce the watchers as opposed to the watchers seducing the women. That's a pretty important difference in the Manichaean mythology. But what's important to note is that the Enochian literature is being taken up by Christians, early Jesus movement people. It's like I said, it's in the Book of Jude. It's clearly being used by Jews, but it's also being adopted by Mani in the 3rd century. And of course, Mani not only adopts it, it becomes one of the 6 canonical texts of Manichaeism. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Manichaeism, in terms of its geographical distribution, is absolutely shocking. All the way from and again, we have more. If you think about languages in which the New Testament's translated into in the first couple of 100 years, right? Little bit of it's getting translated in from into Greek. Maybe some early stuff was in Aramaic into Greek, and then maybe into some Coptic. If you look at the text of Mani, like the Book of Giants, we have at least 6 different languages, from Middle Persian to Sogdian to Chinese to Coptic, that the Book of Giants is being translated into. And insofar as translation is an index of popularity, the Book of Giants, I would say, was probably the most widely read scripture of that time period. It's at some level, right? In terms of geographic distribution and in terms of religious adherence. Everybody was reading it. And this is sort of how history is very strange, that, thank God, had the Ethiopians not preserved it, we would have basically nothing of it. But this attests to the incredible popularity of this book. So again, like, what's really popular now? Of course, we have hardly anything of the Book of Giants, the book of the Giants. But in the 3rd century, it would have been more commonplace, I think, than the Book of Revelations, more commonplace than the Mishnah. And that's really saying something, because we take the Mishnah to be foundational rabbinical Judaism, we take the Book of Revelation to be foundational at some level to Christianity. But the Book of Giants would have been ubiquitously known across the religious spectrum of the ancient world.
Yeah, it really is a text that really finds its way across these worlds. And like you said, just going back to Manichaeism in general, I really like this quote that Jason Badoon had in his book on the Manichaean body. He stressed, and I quote, "The Manichaeans themselves practiced a form of doctrinal translation that diversified their discourse, all equally accommodating to local cultural norms." So, like you said, like, Manny really saw his religion as other religions are a small body of water, right? They're a stream leading through tributaries into the vast ocean that is his final religion, final revelation. So, very interesting that this goes from things like you said in Second Temple Judaism. You have these Jubilee, these Watcher and Giant traditions and Jubilees, Epistle of Enoch, Daniel 4, things like that. Um, and then it gets transferred over to the Manichaeism in the 3rd century, and that travels everywhere. And just by virtue of how Manichaeism is so kind of like Neoplatonism in a way, Neoplatonism is very adaptable to taking things and putting it into its own kind of spin. And Manichaeism kind of does that the same way. So it's very interesting. I think my final historical question, then Stephanie, I'll let you take the reins here. Is Dr. Sledge. Many people may not be too familiar with Manichaeism in general, just in terms of like their cultural milieu and what they believed. I know they have a concept of ascetic ritual to liberate light from the darkness it's encased in, but there's a very complex cosmogony and cosmology along with that. So I didn't know if you could just briefly touch upon that before we move on.
Yeah, and I'll be the first to admit I'm not an expert in Manichaeism. It's not a religion I can claim any expertise in. But basically, we have it's a super complex religion that we don't have a lot of literature from. Unfortunately, you'd be surprised to learn that some of the texts that have survived are literally this big. The text recovered from Meditate Mani is just micrograms. Manichaeism is a dualistic religion. It fundamentally believed the world was divided into a spirit, to good and evil, and that Mani had come on a long line of prophets, including the Buddha, by the way. Buddhism and Jesus were accommodated. Mani himself originates in a Persian milieu, Middle Persian milieu, I think, and so he's coming out of that. He comes from an aristocratic family. And basically, he teaches a gospel of how to liberate yourself from the world of evil. And so in that way, it tracks very closely to what we call Gnosticism, whatever that is. They tend to parallel each other. And this was a heavily proselytizing religion. The most famous person who believed in it for quite some time, of course, was Augustine. Augustine was a Manichaean for many years before he became a Christian. So, in a nutshell, that it's basically that the cosmology and is incredibly complex. And in terms of the Book of Watchers we're talking about here, what's really important about what Mani does with the Book of Watchers is that he's going to very particularly look at in his cosmology where these angels are going to come from in his cosmology, where they come down to Earth to eventually mate with human women. So basically what he does is he takes. And again, it's sort of a game of telephone. We have the line in Genesis 6 that gets built out into the Enochian literature in Enoch 1 and Jubilees to a lesser degree. And then that's built out even more when Mani sort of acculturates it to his unique cosmology. What's difficult about all this is that if you look at the amount of literature that we have from the Book of Watchers, the Manichaean Book of Watchers, we have basically 2 pages worth of text that have survived. It's all very, 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 very fragmentary. And so, and again, it's spread Sogdian and Middle Persian and Coptic. There are chunks of it in the Kephaliah, the Teacher, which is another important Manichaean text. But basically, that's sort of how it gets worked in. Mani is sort of a vacuum cleaner of prophets. He hoovers over all of the things. And again, I think the part of the reason why he hoovers over the Book of Watchers is because of its popularity. I think that it was an incredibly popular book among Jews and Christians. And I think that part of the reason why he brings it into his system and accommodates it to his system is precisely because of its popularity at the time, which again is interesting considering that, it was basically unknown until, at least among outside of the Ethiopian world, the Amharic Orthodox Church, but it was basically unknown until a few centuries ago.
Well said. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, it's very interesting. Jason Badoon points out that Mani came from an Elkosite community in Mesopotamia, so a Jewish apocalyptic community. So another prime example of like dynamic cultural exchange. And like you said, Manny was very much like the vacuum cleaner of prophets. He was the ultimate perennialist. I'm not sure if that's the correct word in putting it towards Manny, but Manny definitely thought that he was taking the best of the best and kind of creating like Homer would the ultimate car in a way. So very interesting.
Although I'd say Manny's religion was a little bit better than Homer's car.
Yeah, true.
No, but yeah, I mean, he's one of the great systematizers in the history of world religion, and it's a pity that less survived, because we tell a story as if Manichaeism is a footnote in history, and most people know it as such. But the truth of the matter is that Manichaeism could have gone the other way, and we'd all been in a Manichaean hegemony.
Absolutely.
There's no reason why it couldn't have gone the other way.
Well, when I was learning about Manichaeanism, because I also am not an expert in this area at all, because my area is not antiquity at all. So when I was learning about this, I thought it was really modern in a way because of the syncretic nature. It just, to me, it didn't really seem like an antique type of religion, because it does incorporate Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Taoism, all of these different belief systems and religions that, to me, it seemed very, very fresh, as something that people today would probably feel, keen to learn more about. And it is a shame that there isn't really much more material, textual material left over from it. But I don't know if the materials that I was reading would agree with what you were talking about, Justin. But the core myth, I guess you could say, of Manichaeanism is that this dualistic idea of that it was like 3 stages, if I recall correctly, that there were the first creation stage, that you had spirit and matter, or light and dark, or good and evil, however you want to call it, that there was these 2 separate principles. And then there was a second creation where these 2 principles were mingled, and out of that mingling came human beings, came the worlds, everything that we know. So our history, and even our current day, or our current times, because we're still in this second creation. And then there's this third creation that that's like the end, where the dualistic principles are separated again, and it goes back to the way it had been originally. And I don't know if that coincides with how you understand from your texts.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a general read. Yeah, I think that's a general
read.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that it would be popular today because of its degree of syncretizing. I think everyone likes Gnosticism until they get to the dualism. Like dualism, they're like, oh yeah, your body's evil and the physical world's bad and you need to escape it. I think most people are like, I don't really like that part. I like the other parts. But yeah, it's the pretty strong dualism, I think, is what turns off most people. And I think part of the reason why it didn't, these dualistic religions don't really make it. Even Zoroastrianism, which has some elements of dualism, is ultimately monist. It's apocalyptic monism. It just, things are going to get solved in the past and in the future, rather. And Manichaeism is a bit like that in that way.
So another thing that I thought was interesting in this system is that you have the world of light and the world of darkness, as they call it, at least in the text that I was reading, and it's in the second creation period. It's the world of darkness that's actually producing Adam and Eve, the angels that fall, all of the Nephilim, all of these characters that we're discussing today. This comes out of the world of darkness. And I found that also very interesting and intriguing, that we're placed in this, we as human beings are placed in this dimension, I guess you could say. And yeah, I don't know if there is then what's still unclear to me is at the end in this third creation, what happens to human beings then? Because it says, that the it's going to go back to a dualistic nature where you have light and dark, or however you want to call it, spirit and matter. What happens to humans in this process? Does the text say?
I think that again, everything is so fragmentary, but I think the idea is that basically the followers of Mani will undergo these purifications that will allow them to their true self to become ultimately separated off as spirit, and they'll survive
As
in the
spirit,
spiritual world,
okay.
and that the physical world will basically be, it's a husk to be left behind. And so,
Okay.
and that's why, again, we don't know a lot about the Manichaean rituals so much, but there were ascetic practices, of some sort, that are detailed in the Manichaean body, that basically ensure that you end up in the world of light, in the world of the good. So again, some coterminous stuff with texts like the Apocryphon of John, or even the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, that there's a real core self that isn't physical, and that real core self that isn't physical will persist after death, assuming you sufficiently separate yourself off through various kinds of purifications or initiation. Everybody has their own flavor and their own road up the mountain. I was just covering the Books of You last week, which has, I think, the most complicated and complex system of that exists in ancient literature. So one just gets the sense that the 3rd century was crappy, that everybody was just trying to get out of town. And it kind of was in some ways. Like, you do get some elements about the 3rd century that aren't so great, but you just get, there's just this turn beginning in, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century to a lesser degree, where, things weren't that bad then, actually. 6th century in many ways was far worse. But maybe, arguments have made it's the worst century ever. But you just get the sense that the zeitgeist of the time was getting the hell out of Dodge. That, bodies are bad and let's get out of here. So that seems to have been the thing. And you had lots of flavors for doing, including Christianity, right? Christianity also promises a glorified body that will be very unlike Paul talks about, sort of a spiritual body that will come after this one. So even Christianity is sort of on that train. The Hermeticists are on that train. I think the only people really not are like rabbinical Judaism. I think they're one of the weird holdouts who are just like, no, the body's okay.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because in my discussion with Wouter Hanegraaff about his new book about this spiritual Hermeticism, he's very adamant that the Hermetic texts are not this dualistic type of matter is evil, spirit is good, and that we need to try to separate this, that we can achieve this spiritual gnosis and enlightenment in the body. So I would, learning what he was talking about, I would say that might be one of the what do you call it, the exceptions to the rule of the others that were going along. But Hermeticism was also highly persecuted at that time too, and a lot of people were put to death if they found out, if the Roman Empire, the state, found out that they were practicing. So maybe these people weren't really going around telling other people about how they practiced.
Yeah, and even that idea with the Hermeticist is still sort of a you're not going to get a resurrected body in the Hermetica. You're going to, you can practice reverence in this life, and then you can achieve, and you purify your soul of the daemones, and then in your death you'll go back to the one. But it's still an idea that ultimately you're not this. This is, you can achieve gnosis in this vehicle, but this vehicle is something you will leave behind. That's very different than rabbinical Judaism that makes it a tenet of faith that you have to believe that you'll be physically resurrected, that the physical body is not a thing that is bad. And then in fact, rabbinical Judaism makes a big push about, you have to be physically buried in a proper way because your physical body is going to come back. And Christianity certainly leans on that as well. But I think with even the Hermetica, I think ultimately the ultimate goal is to get out of town, is to get out of this and get back to the monad. and you do that through the purification of your soul of all the evil stuff that daimones,
Right.
the planetary daimones do.
Yeah, that's a good point that you make about the body not being eternal. We'll get into this later on about how the viewpoints are now kind of shifting within New Age ideas, that there might be this possibility of having this immortal state, that you don't even die. So there's kind of shifts in the way people are approaching the idea of this spiritual purification in that
And what is
regard.
constitutive of death? That was also a thing,
Yeah.
right? That the New Testament says that you will not taste death. And so when people started actually
Right.
dying, they had to pivot. And they're like, crap, like,
Oops.
so what does death mean? Oh, it's this, it means something else. Yeah. So again, never let the facts get in the way of the truth. Whether it's the New Testament or whatever, don't ever let that happen. So, but yeah, in the New Age, and bringing these ideas of the Nephilim and stuff like that into modern culture, it's amazing how, in the same way they were incredibly popular in the ancient world, they have also become incredibly popular now. And I think I said this behind in the studio before we went on, is that you would be impressed or shocked or surprised how often I get comments on the channel about the Nephilim. People are always interesting, asking me questions. I got one the other day about, do I think the Nephilim built anything before they were destroyed by the flood? And I'm like, I don't think the Nephilim are real. I think it's a myth, like Prometheus. Hey, maybe Prometheus is real too. So it's amazing how perennially interesting. Again, if you watch the History Channel, these stories are just perennially interesting. And I think it's because people forget that apocalypticism is often less concerned about the impending doom that's coming in the future. Apocalypticism is much more concerned about the primordial past. Now, that's definitely true of ancient Jewish apocalypticism. It's much more interested in the primordial past. And I think that that's sort of a weird way that you get this sort of closed loop, that by learning about the primordial past with the Watchers and the Nephilim, somehow you learn something about what's about to happen in the future. So perhaps that's why these entities remain perennially interesting, and also why I've never made an episode about the Nephilim, just because I don't want to feed into the fire of this stuff. But I have done one on the Rephaim, which are tangentially related.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, just you don't have to go into great depth, but what are the differences there?
So there's a whole host of beings that eventually get built out of this system. We have what are called the sons of God, at least in the New Testament or the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. They're probably originally literally sons of El. If we track it back to the old Bronze Age mythology, El had 70 sons, and we see that exact stuff repeated in other places in the Hebrew Bible. So that's probably just a holdover from old indigenous Bronze Age Canaanite. And they come to Earth, but they fall. They clearly come from the sky. The word nafal in Hebrew literally means to fall. And so they are literally the fallen ones. And they mate with human women. And again, as we mentioned, the Manichaean version has the women seducing the sons of God as opposed to the other way around. They're led by an angel named Semyaza, whose name has lots of different forms. In Hebrew, his name literally means the one that sees the name. There's a great midrash about him where the first woman they come to attempt to seduce, she tricks them. She says, "Hey, you know the divine name. Tell me the divine name, and you can have sex with me." And he's like, "Okay," because he's not very smart, clearly. And he tells her the divine name, and so she says it out loud, and she immediately is transformed into the Pleiades, and so she escapes being sexually subjected to these fallen angels. And also, by the way, this is an alternative theory of the origin of evil. Remember that Christianity will pioneer the satanic rebellion theory. The satanic rebellion theory is a later theory about the origin of evil compared to the Enochian theory, which is all about how these fallen angels taught human beings all kinds of bad stuff. Although in the Manichaean version, they teach them good stuff, which is interesting to some degree as well. but you get an offspring of a lot of these creatures. You get watchers, which are something like the Nephilim. You get giants, Giborim, the strong ones. You also, when these texts get translated into Greek, you get creatures like the Grigori, which are something like giants as well. And so you have a whole species and subsets of these. These also get mixed up with creatures called the Rephaim, which the Hebrew Bible tends to take. So the Raphauma, as they were known originally in Ugaritic, these are just basically deified dead kings. They were kings in the afterlife who had basically become deified. And what it seems like happens is that the Israelites make them into, and the Israelites can't quite make their mind up about what they are, but they tend to make them into giants, and mostly as a whipping boy for the Israelites. So the Israelites can show how badass they are. Abraham beats up the Rephaim, and then eventually other people beat up the Rephaim to show how the Israelites are so dominant. But they're also giants. The famous line of Caleb and the spies that we are but grasshoppers before them, which is very evocative.
So would then the story of David and Goliath also fall into this category?
Yeah, so the Goliath is just described as an Anakim, which are another one of these descendants of the Rephaim. Which is interesting because the Bible also can't make its mind about who kills Goliath. The earlier version probably has Elkanah doing it, but eventually the myth is transposed and given the credits given to David for killing Goliath. But yeah, he becomes one of the descendants of the Anakim. And then you get all kinds of problems, right? Because if the Watchers and the giants and the Nephilim are around in King David's time, or if they're around in Caleb's time, when the time of the spies, well, how did they survive the flood? Because that was the whole point.
That's the question. Yeah.
Right? Because the whole point was,
right.
At least in the book of Enoch, the story you get basically is that the giants got so big and they were just eating everything that God wanted to wipe them out. And the only clue we get in the Bible is that it says the world was full of Hamas, which means violence, right? And that it's not clear what Hamas is in this case. And so what the book of Enoch does and the book of Jubilees does is it fleshes out what exactly the Hamas was. And the Hamas was all these giants have to eat. And so they just eat everything. They're just massacring and eating everything, like just throwing whole sheep in their mouth or whatever. And the God doesn't like the idea they're doing this. And so he's like, all right, I'm going to wipe them out. And that's why the flood. But then the question is, if that was the point of the flood, then how did they survive? And you get all kinds of great stories like Og of Bashan, who's famously known for his height, is said in the Midrashim literature to have in one version he's holding onto the side of the ark to survive the flood, and in the other version he's standing on top of it. So I always imagine him like surfing on top of Noah's Ark for 40 days and 40 nights to survive the flood. Because if you do the math, Og of Bashan, he seems to have predated he seems to have lived been born before the flood and survived it. So this is what's interesting. These people are very close readers of this text. They notice weird mathematical discrepancies or historical or narrative discrepancies, and they fill the gap. And what do they fill it with? Nephilim. When in doubt, Nephilim did it. And I think that's why it fires the imagination now, because we're all raised in some kind of Christian adjacent, Bible adjacent world. And it fires the imagination precisely because we know so little about them. But now we have the book of Enoch and at least fragments of the books of the Watchers and the book of Jubilees and stuff like that fills it out. Now, what's fascinating to me about that is how people today, I get a comment. I have an episode on my channel on the third book of Enoch. And one of the more common comments that I get, which is very strange, is that the first book of Enoch is great. That one really is scripture that was lost, but the second and third ones are from the devil. I'm like, how did you make this decision? Like, how did you, by what canonical system are you deciding that first Enoch is kosher and second and third Enoch is not, especially considering that first Enoch is at least 5 books stitched together that don't often have much to do with each other when you get down to the textual reception of them. They're distinct books, really. But yeah, if folks ever get a chance, you can go to the Israeli Antiquities Authority website and you can look at the fragments of the books of Enoch and the book of the Watchers. And it is really amazing how little survives. Just like just when I say fragments, it just looks like the Romans went in there and tore it up. Which I think is what happened actually with a lot of those texts. I think that they're in that state because the Romans went in those caves looking for treasure, and they were like, crap, stupid books.
Who wants books?
Yeah, Romans, I can imagine. But yeah, I think that's why some of those texts are in such bad shape, especially Cave 4. Although, again, the books of Enoch are distributed. There are 12 different fragments of the Book of Enoch, maybe more, but they're distributed through all the caves. It's not like we find a bunch in Cave 4, a bunch in Cave 9. They're distributed pretty evenly through the caves.
Yeah, in my research, I was blown away by how many fragments there were just distributed throughout all these caves. It was really eye-opening. And I think I have a solution for how the Watchers survived. If you watch Darren Aronofsky's Noah, they help Russell Crowe build the Ark, so maybe they made a deal with him behind the scenes. Who knows?
Yeah, this is a story come from Midrash. Part of what's really great about that movie and having a Jewish guy basically write it is that he did his homework. He really read the Midrashim, and a lot of the stuff that goes into that movie is actually from rabbinical literature. So he did a great job. It made the Christians very angry because he was like, he's adding things that aren't in the Bible. And I'm like, yeah, but he's putting things that are in Jewish lore, which ironically is what this text comes from.
Yeah, I love that movie. I don't know how anybody could hate that movie, but then again, Last Temptation is one of my favorite movies too. So I guess I'm not the authority for blasphemy or what's not blasphemy.
But interesting though, in the movie Noah, the Watchers, is it the Watchers of the Nephilim? That are rock. They're kind of like rock monsters or something, and that I felt was, when looking at all the other representations of Nephilim in pop culture, that was like one of the very few that I saw of that type of expression.
It was interesting because you get the sense that they're spiritual beings sort of made of fire that plunged to earth, and when they plunged to earth, they sort of like, it's like they magma, and the magma cooled around them. And so they're rock on the outside, but spiritual being on the inside, which I think is a neat kind of dualism.
Interesting.
Like you kind of get some like dualist vibes from that. Like, oh yeah, they're not physical the way we are, but they can take on physicality because of being plunged to earth in that way. So yeah, I thought that was a neat way of handling them. Although clearly in the Book of Enoch, they're people-like. I mean, the Nephilim are not. I mean, if the Nephilim aren't the giants, they give birth to the giants, but they couldn't be giants because they have sex with human women, and so there must be, relatively humanoid at some level. I do like in the Book of Enoch though that Simyaza, when he's trying to pitch this idea to the rest of the fallen angels, he's like, yeah, like let's go down there and have sex with, the Earth girls are easy. Let's go down there and have sex with all the human women. And the other angels were like, you go first. I don't want to get in trouble. And they were like, all right, let's bind. They basically have like a pact they make with each other, so that they all have to go down together. So it's like a prisoner's dilemma problem. I really love
I was just pulling that up. I found that very amusing. He was like,
hilarious.
I fear that perhaps you will not consent that this deed should be done, and I alone will become responsible for this great sin. But they all responded to him, let us swear an oath and bind everyone among us.
Mutual execrations.
Yeah, it was very...
I love that phrase. It's like the crappiest translation, but it's a really great turn of phrase. Mutual execrations. It should be a band name. We'll bind each other by mutual execrations to go down and do this. But again, as a theory of evil, I think this is it's one of these fabulous things about sort of what to do with, one of the things about the apocalyptic is the origin of evil. And the Enochic theory of the origin of evil, that is to say that this was the result of angels coming here to have sex with women, and then they taught us a bunch of bad stuff, like how to make cosmetics and weapons of war, or pharmacology or whatever, that it's just an interesting counter theory to the one we always think of, which is the angelic insurrection. And the angelic insurrection theory is a much later Christian one. And I do like the fact that even in Christianity, they still can't quite work out their theory of evil. What exactly is, how exactly evil got into the world, which is interesting.
Yeah, if we stay with Enoch and then talking about the bad watchers or Nephilim and what they were doing with the human women, I found this an interesting aspect that it says that they taught the women their secrets, and these secrets were not supposed to be taught to human beings. That was considered, grossly immoral for human beings to know about all these things, such as astrology, sorcery, and magic, and
Knowledge of
as you
herbs.
mentioned, cosmetics, divination with the use of mirrors,
Right.
how to interpret clouds and the phases of the moon and the signs of the sun and all these things that nowadays, you see how this has all played out throughout history, and how women have always been put in that kind of position of the witch, the wise, the wise woman, but also in the pejorative sense, the woman who knows things that she's not supposed to know. So I find that to be an interesting, as you said, this whole idea of the problem of evil. Where does that come from? And that does seem to kind of, in a way, kind of fits with this in the biblical idea of the sin of the woman being tempted by the serpent, which also I find interesting in the text that I was reading about who that actually was. That was in the text material that I read. It was a watcher called Samael, and he was supposed to be watching over the human beings, but he was actually tempting Eve. This is the story. I don't know if this is true or not, because there's always so many different interpretations. Right. But the story that I read is that Samael put the tree of knowledge in the garden and was punished and cursed by God for doing so. Then came back as the serpent to tempt Eve to get her to finally eat the fruit of that tree. And then that's when everything went to hell. Right. Then he stuck around and slept with Eve, and he's the father of Cain.
Yep.
So these are, incredible stories that nowadays you see so many references to in all of these different popular culture outlets and media, and all forms of media and entertainment, that these are such pervasive ideas. They just stay with us.
Yeah, then the whole business of Eve is really interesting, because again, we think about sort of because we live in a Christian adjacent world, that the first sin really is the sin of Eve. And that sin is passed down from generation to generation, and that's part of the mythology of Christianity, is that Jesus comes to fix that. But it's interesting that at the time that Enoch is being composed, that's not their theory of evil. And clearly, in the book of Ezekiel, there's no sense of inherited evil, and the book of Ezekiel rejects that idea that there could be anything like inherited evil. And what's interesting is that they're trying to get this theory of evil off the ground, and they're like, all right, let's do it with Samael, and he makes Cain, and that makes murder, and that's how murder comes into the world. In later Kabbalistic versions, Lilith will be involved in seducing Adam, and that's how you get a bunch of demons from that as well. But it's interesting that if it is the case that Eve generates sin into the world, then the Enoch story becomes redundant, right? And that's an interesting kind of the logic of evil, that there's still, I always say that theology is always you're always building the ship at sea, and that the book of Enoch is clearly an example where they're not quite sure where evil comes from. And of course, always you can blame a woman. That's just the way dudes do. And in this case, it's all the women that learned all this stuff from the Nephilim and the Watchers. I do like the fact that they teach them cosmetics, which means that they must have been wearing them. You never think of the Nephilim as like, maybe it's you, maybe it's maybe it's Maybelline, maybe it's the Nephilim. So I like them
I imagine they were going around like Motley Crue or something.
Yeah, it's like glam metal.
Glam
metal.
But it is interesting that in order to know something about cosmetics, they must have been fabulous. But But yeah, this is the kind of things that go with this. Metallurgy also is in the list of things that they teach them. So, but yeah, I think that this is part of what makes the books of Enoch eternally interesting. Is that we live in a world that's rife with evil, and we want to know where it comes from. And the books of Enoch give us a pretty detailed story as to where it comes from. But yeah, I think that's why it's, and also there's just the allure of secret knowledge that Genesis hints, but Enoch tells. So we're very lucky that this survived among the Ethiopians. Again, I think it's really important to name that they preserved it. And it's interesting who thought this text was canonical, even in the early Christian world. Tertullian did. Many people early on in Christianity felt that the books of Enoch, that the first book of Enoch at least, was to some degree authoritative. That's really, to me, that's really interesting. What becomes canon and what doesn't? Clearly, the writer of the Epistle of Jude, they quote it once, and so does that make it canon? Like, or is that one line canon? I've always wondered this for.
Who decides on this?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite. You folks have seen those bumper stickers, right? Where it has like the Bible verse, like John 3:16. It's just like the Bible verse reference in a bumper sticker. I've always wanted to get one that's like 2 Peter, and it's whatever the verse it says. Hey, I left a coat there, and don't trust Alexandrios the coppersmith. I'm like, don't trust that dude. Can you imagine being that coppersmith? For 2,000 years, the only thing we know about him is that Paul thought he was shady. And that becomes Holy Writ. And I left my coat there. I want to come get my coat.
The makers of The Chosen really do need to do a spin-off about that guy. Just
about
a little mini-series. Yeah. His little story of redemption.
But again, the fact that of all the books that Mani had at his disposal, the Book of Enoch is the one that makes it in. It's not the Gospels. It's not any of the books. He had a wide range of books he could have. By the 3rd century, he had a huge library of things that he could have tapped in the matrix of that world. And of all the books that he chooses to tap, that's the one.
That's the one. Yeah, interesting. There must have been something about that story with the Nephilim that he disliked that a lot. I guess it was just one of those things. I mean, like I said, I find it fascinating that all of this, that this was so popular then, and it's still so popular now, and that I'm so surprised that Justin, that you get so many questions about this. Because I guess people think that you would know something about it, and that it's also kind of keeping you from actually talking about it because you're like, I don't really want to go there. That's very, I find that all very, very interesting. But how the ideas are adapted and assimilated and appropriated, this is what's fascinating to me, the whole the creativity that people have nowadays, and if we're looking at the contemporary reception of these ideas. For example, Cain, we were just talking about Cain. In 1996, I'm going to refer to my notes here because I need to know what the date is. In 1996, White Wolf Publishing brought out a tabletop role-playing game called Vampire: The Dark Ages. I have not played this myself, but I've read about it, where the figure of Cain is, as we were talking about, the first murderer cursed by God to be a vampire.
Yeah, it becomes the first vampire.
And yes, and this whole idea of the blood drinking of the Nephilim. There are accounts that they were cannibalistic blood drinkers, very violent murderers. And the way that the vampire myth is then, interlaced into this narrative. So Cain was then also temporarily linked with Lilith. They were lovers for a period of time in this game. And if we follow the narrative of the Midrash that I think you were talking about, the Midrash where I think you were mentioning it. I thought that's what I was understanding from you. There was a Midrash where it was talking about Samael being a watcher.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly
in the by the rise of the Kabbalah, he becomes.
Okay.
Yeah, he becomes.
So if we're kind of looking at the technicalities of things, then Cain would Cain be a Nephilim then?
So this is where
if he was fathered by Samael.
Yeah, this is where things get where the text becomes very muddy, because if we follow the if we assume the historiography of the Hebrew Bible, then the Nephilim occur centuries after Cain and Abel.
Okay.
Right, because it's in Genesis 6 that we get the Nephilim.
Yeah.
And so you get a huge, like, it's clear that they're backfilling the story without much attention to who's on first. Because if it's the case that the Nephilim occur at the time of the flood, right, that's the time of Noah. I mean, Noah's father was Methuselah, Noah's father was, I think, Methuselah, who lived 969 years. We're talking about huge swaths of time in biblical thought, way back, going back, and I think Adam lives for 900 years or something. I can't keep track of these people. Although I do like the Midrash. It says that Methuselah is the most sad person in the entire history of the world, because the Bible says that he lived for 969 years and he died. That he didn't do anything of worth, despite the fact nothing worth mentioning for 969 years. The only thing we know is that Methuselah lived for 969 years and he died. He's the most tragic character in all of history, because he had the most time and did nothing with it, nothing worth recording. But so the historiography gets really mucky, because if it's the case that the Nephilim come down in Genesis 6, then what in the hell is Samael doing back in Genesis 1?
Yeah.
What is he doing back there? And the Kabbalah gives us a story as to what he's doing back there. But of course, that's centuries later.
Well, the beautiful thing about fiction is that they can do whatever they want. Sure. And so, this story says, that Cain was with Lilith, and it's very complex. Of course, I can't tell you the whole story here, but this White Wolf Publishing company, they also had many series in their, I think what they called it their, actually,
White Wolf.
They call it the world. Don't they call it the World of Darkness series?
Yeah, it's like Vampire the Masquerade.
That's
and the Werewolf the
Yes,
Apocalypse,
exactly.
And Mage the Ascension.
Yeah, I'm having
exactly
flashbacks
because
to,
we should be asking the guy with the Boy Harsher shirt. If anyone who's going to know this, it's going to be the guy with the Boy Harsher shirt.
I did play Vampire the Masquerade when I was in high school. I will admit.
I think you have to. If you have,
I'm having
if you get caught
flashbacks
wearing a Boy Harsher shirt and not play Vampire the Masquerade, you get a fine. The goth police.
I mean, all I could tell you is
come for you.
All I could tell you is, in White Wolf lore, so to speak, in that world, Cain is the first vampire, and strangely enough, he does found a city called Enoch. After this city,
wasn't there a king Enoch? Wasn't he the king?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
In the Watchers, he has a really interesting situation where in the Book of the Giants, it's interesting because the giants begin to have dreams about their impending doom, and they actually go to Enoch to interpret their dreams. And Enoch tells them, like, you need to get your life together, because otherwise God's going to kill you all. And basically the Watchers in the Aramaic version, which we don't have the ending of, we just know that the Watchers are like, whatever, we can do what we want. We're giants. We can do whatever we like. And then God kills them all, because Enoch's like, I told you this was going to happen. But in the Manichaean version, we have the fuller ending. And then we have them also not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then the angels, the four archangels. But there's the fourth one is a unique one to the Manichaean text, whose name is slipping my mind now. But ultimately, they begin the process of wiping out the giants in preparation for the flood. So,
this
Manichaean
is all super
text
interesting.
It's very different than the Manichaean text is. We have a more complete ending than the Aramaic that survives. And although I will say this, and this is getting into a little bit of speculative territory. One of the major scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who toward the end of his life became a little bit of a disrepute because of some alcohol problems, some anti-Semitism problems, which was unfortunate on both accounts. But he alleged that during the first Gulf War, he saw a microfilm of the entire Book of Enoch in Aramaic that had been stolen from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that basically a Kuwaiti, I think this is how the story goes, that a Kuwaiti who had basically gone over to Saddam And once the Americans were coming through, obviously this Kuwaiti who'd gone over to Saddam is not going to. His life is not going to go well once the Kuwaitis take back control. He was basically trying to use the copy of Enoch to get himself out of Kuwait. And I would look his name up. It's Sturgeon, I think. But he's like a really reputable. He was one of the first guys working on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he says he saw a complete Aramaic copy of Enoch 1 in the 90s. And I've talked to some other Dead Sea Scroll people, and they're like, some of them are like, nah, but some of them are like, this is a weird story to make up.
Yeah.
And I kind of tend to believe it might be, the amount of stuff that the Qataris and the Kuwaitis buy. That if they had if there were a complete book of Enoch out there in Aramaic, I could easily imagine it being in a lockbox in Kuwait. But allegedly he saw the microfilm, just a microfilm of it, which would be just amazing if we could recover.
Yeah.
It. So, at any rate, speculation, but
intriguing.
But intriguing possibilities about what still might be out there. Let me find who his name. I think.
Yeah, I'm sure nobody's keeping that Aramaic Enoch in a freezer. So hopefully
like
there's
crazy
still
people
care
did.
of it.
Yeah. Who was it? Yeah, it was John Strugnell, who died in 2007. He said he saw it in 1990. And again, Strugnell, I mean, he's not. It's just there's a thing. There was a tendency among some Dead Sea Scroll scholars to go off the deep end. This happened to Allegro. Happened to Strugnell. There's something about the Dead Sea Scrolls that kind of makes some people wacky.
Yeah, they kind of become Ahab, don't they? After a while,
like something. I think it's just like if you see pictures of what they were doing. I mean, can you imagine spending 25 years looking at fragments that somehow have two letters on them, trying to piece them? I think it makes you crazy.
Yeah, it's hard to know how that affects you.
I mean, imagine trying to solve a puzzle that has no edges, and it must have. I mean, I can imagine it being crazy making.
Yeah. Indeed.
But yeah, these are fascinating texts, and I think that, and again, like you said, the amount of like metal bands that are now named Samael and Nephilim, and the amount of video games that the Nephilim show up in, they've just become part of the common currency of the mythology of sort of Abrahamic mythology in a broader way. It's just amazing how much of an impact it's had.
Right. Well, I mentioned White Wolf, but there are also other video games out there. There's one called Devil May Cry. And this I found interesting. Dante and Virgil are brothers, and they're Nephilim in this video game. The whole Diablo series, Nephilim are also in that, along with Lilith. And so, it's just ever returning. The music, as you said, Fields of Nephilim, later the Nephilim.
One of my favorites.
Right. I mean, I listen to them. Come on. I mean,
I just want to make a point about Fields. Like when I was growing up, Fields are directly responsible for me getting into Gilgamesh and all that Sumerian stuff. When I was just like dicking around in community college, and I'm like, I'll take a Western Civ class, because I need a course, because my dad will get off my back. But then I'm like, oh, this is weird. I just listened to Elysium and they're talking about all this stuff in history. It's just really weird how it affects everything that way. I love the Nephilim, and like Carl McCoy just really got into ceremonial magic towards the end there, really hard. I mean, he still does it pretty. Every field show is very much like a ritual. Very interesting. Okay. So
interesting. I will check it out. But yeah, I thought, I mean, of course, you have bands with names like that. Other bands use Nephilim in their titles. You have Mastodon uses it. Behemoth uses it. So a lot of the metal bands, as you said, Justin, if in films and TV, I mean, we've already talked about Noah, but there's Kevin Smith's Dogma. That's kind of a classic movie about the Watchers. I think Ben Affleck's character was supposed to be a Watcher. The X-Files had them in the Supernatural, the series Supernatural, the Prophecy movies, the Mortal Instruments books and series, the series Lucifer. It's everywhere. And I just saw somebody's comment in the chat room. They're like, there's like 10,000 videos on YouTube about the Nephilim.
Oh,
It's just everywhere. So
which is funny to me because, and again, this is like, if you, and I guess I have a heterodox reading of them, that there tends to be something about like how metal they are, because we tend to conflate the romantic vision of Satan as a fallen angel with the Nephilim, because their name literally means the fallen ones. But if you read the texts of Genesis and you read the text of Jubilees and Enoch, they come across as horny teenagers. They don't come across as like fearsome, scary angels. They just come across as like incels who like want to get laid. And I guess I've never gotten the romantic aspect of them, because when I read, I'm a text guy, when I read these stories, I'm like, they're just like 17-year-olds. They're angelic 17-year-olds who really want to, have sex with a woman for the first time, and they're just like you. And I love the way the rabbinical literature actually makes them bumbling, that they get tricked by the first woman, that they don't know, even when they try to have sex, they don't know what to do, because they're they're sort of like bumbling 15-year-olds. And so I for me, it's always struck me as interesting that these characters become sort of fiery, scary, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But at least in most of literature preserved, they're just kind of horny teenagers, which I think that again, like how we read these texts and through which lens we read these texts, that in the Christian world, because they become associated with Satan, they become edgecore, cool goth angels or whatever. But in the Jewish world, they're just sort of like, yeah, these are horny teenagers. Like they're not to be feared. They're just like, in the same way that, imagine if like a 15-year-old was trying to teach his girlfriend how to, I don't know, from the Anarchist Cookbook, build a pipe bomb or something. They're just dangerous kids. And so I think that's a much, for me, and when I read the rabbinical literature, that's the read that I take of them. And that they're not metal at all. They're just like cringy goth kids with like pipe bombs, and you're like, ugh.
I look at it almost as like, it's like the 3rd century BCE version of Superbad. It's like these really like silly dudes like who want to be really edgy, but
right,
just
but they're really bad at it.
And that might actually, maybe that speaks to the edgelord in all of us. The Nephilim are our edgelord selves. I don't know.
Yeah, and again, it's just how they get taken up into this Christian adjacent world, this Christian hegemonic world, where the devil, because he's kind of gone through this, Satan has gone through this romantic transformation beginning in the 19th century, that the Nephilim are sort of become Satan adjacent, and they benefit from that romanticizing, Satan becoming sort of the anti-hero. But yeah, when you read the texts, actually read the texts, they don't come across as anti-heroes. They come across as like, kind of bumbling kids.
It's interesting that you say that about them being, kind of, sex-starved creatures out there, because when I was doing a little search on just online to see, what kind of stuff is out there in pop culture, I did find a paranormal romance novel where the Nephilim are erotic male characters that possess other people and go around and have sex with women and have children with women. So this is, completely, you think that they're popping up in romance novels now, but it's
not sex, of course,
everywhere.
Yeah,
it's everywhere, and it's sex. Yeah,
it's sex sells, of course. Yeah, the Nephilim. But again, it's funny that they become sort of, again, seductive, vampire-like, Dracula-like characters.
Yeah.
But again, even that scene where they're in First Enoch, where they're like arguing who goes first. Like, well, we're gonna have to bind each other mutual execrations because I want to get in trouble if I'm, Semyon's like, I don't want to be caught dead, red-handed with this. You just look, it looks like kids. That's the kind of thing kids do. They're like, you jump first. No, you jump first. Let's all jump together. The text, and this is the thing I go to, is that one of the things that we rob ancient text of is humor. If you read, for instance, the story of Genesis, the Garden of Eden story, and you read it in Hebrew, the Hebrew has puns, the Hebrew has word plays, the Hebrew has all kinds of things. And if you read it on the face of it and just block off John Milton for 1 second, right, where it's all supposed to be cosmically bad or whatever, just get John Milton out of your head and you read it, it's about a boy child and a woman child, girl child, basically being tricked by a talking snake to eat. It's funny. And you see the wordplay, right? You hear wordplays like the snake is Arum, is clever, and the Adam and Eve, they're Arumim, they're naked. Typically, when we see puns like that, typically in most cultures, that's flashing to us that this is meant to be funny.
Yeah.
And we rob these texts of their humor by making them, oh, it's about a fall from grace, and it becomes everything becomes John Miltonized. And when I read Enoch, what I see is the humor. That these texts were meant to be funny, and that the Nephilim were not meant to be scary creatures. They weren't meant to be sort of like, terrifying. We're making fun of them because they came to Earth to have sex with women and got themselves killed. It's a cautionary tale about, like, don't let your, horny teenage vibes undo you. So again, I think that we should. Part of what and again, I think this is not unique to us. I mean, Mani clearly took it very seriously as well. But I think another reading is just, let's not leave these texts bereft of the humor, which I think was actually there to begin with.
That's also interesting because if you'll allow me, I have two other examples of things that I found that I thought were very, very interesting. And if we look at books, there's lots of books out there with Nephilim in them. But one series that I thought was really creative, I'm going to look at my notes again. It's the Victor Rehnquist series by Mick Farren, where Nephilim are an ancient alien race. Of course, we have to have aliens in the story somewhere. They created a proto-vampire race, and they also created another race called the Urshu, which were a race of watchers. And one of these watchers was Cthulhu. And I thought that was hilarious because Farron is really mixing it up here with all
Lovecraft
of the different
and everything.
Different
go hard or go home.
Right. I thought that was great. Another one was called Sigma Force by James Rollins. And he portrays the Watchers as a hybrid species of early humans and Neanderthals. So there's no angels or anything in there. But they created Atlantis. So the creativity is just off the charts here. I just think as far as looking at it in a lighthearted way, kind of, the humorous way, I think that, you see that a lot.
Yeah, we have a deck of mythological things in Western civilization, and what you do is you shuffle the deck, and you're like Atlantis, Nephilim, aliens, done. now it's a young adult romance, young adult novel series.
But that's where it's going. I mean, that's what you see a lot of times. I mean, there are all these other series that I didn't even mention, but there are a lot of young people that are, they're either themselves Nephilim, they have to redeem themselves, or they have to protect humans, or there's just all these other storylines that are coming out in all these fictional stories, of course. And I think that is what it's intended for. It's intended to be entertainment. It's intended to be lighthearted and just, an interesting tale. But there are people who take this very seriously. And I did find a lot of things. I did find a few things that would, indicate that people aren't just thinking this is all just, fun and fiction.
I mean, the Bible, there's still fundamentalists that read the Bible literally. And
right.
If the Bible says they're Nephilim, they're Nephilim.
For example, I found an article from a website called BibleStudyTools.com. I don't know exactly what kind of denomination or, what this is related to, but they're talking about the Nephilim in this article, asking if they still roam the earth today. They're not being sarcastic here. They're not being satirical. And they unequivocally state in this article that the Nephilim did exist. They were real. And that they are now, quote, bound and chained in hell until the judgment. So these there are people that think that these beings were real, that they're still real. They're someplace else right now. They're going to come back. On the flip side, I found another blog post from someone who invoked Samael and goes into a description of how he did this. This person gives a bit of background about Samael, and in very, very, I would say, sober academic type of fashion, trying to explain the history of Samael, giving a general outline of his invocation ritual, talking about the grimoires that he referenced, he studied and referenced how he altered the rituals to work for him, which kind of suggests to me that we might be talking about chaos magic here, but I don't want to make any claims because he didn't specifically say. And he edited the blog post later, like several years later, to kind of correct mistakes that he had made before. So he's taking this very seriously. And the discussions that he has in his comment section also are quite serious about, how are we interacting with these grimoires? How are we practicing? How are we referring? How do we communicate with these beings? And it's not considered a game at all.
No. People summon. I mean, trust me, I get people asking me basically every week. I get questions on how to summon angels to get their ex-wife back or punish their ex-wife alternatively. People are definitely serious about this stuff. Which is funny with Samael is that that at least in Jewish lore, Samael is thought of as castrated. He's a castrated being whose penis doesn't work. And that's why he's so angry, is that he and Lilith were forged together. And that Lilith, Samael, and they're sort of counter Adam and Eve. But whereas Adam and Eve can procreate, Lilith is barren and Samael is impotent and castrated. And that's what makes them so angry, is that. And so I often see guys, summon Samael. He's like a fierce warlord. And I'm like, yeah, he's real angry. He's so fierce because he needs like angel Viagra. He's just really sexually frustrated.
He's very frustrated guy.
Yeah. And so again, it's just funny, like what legends survive and which ones don't. And we want Samael to be like this and like that. But the lore and the legends really go all over the place in terms of what this entity is like. And it's interesting what people pick and choose, right? Like we want to represent the Nephilim typically as pretty scary, fierce creatures. Whereas I think an argument can be made that they're in fact the opposite, deal with Samael. And again, how these creatures get revalorized, how Lilith becomes goes from basically a succubus who is responsible for crib death to becoming a feminist icon. Myths or protean, that's why they work, because they are able to adapt and change. And again, the Book of the Watchers, right? It originates in a Jewish milieu and in Palestine, 3rd century BCE, and it's taken up into a 3rd century CE Persian milieu, and it spoke to people. That's bizarre, and it spoke to people from here to China. So that's, to me, like, it's unsurprising if that can happen in the 3rd century with the slow rate of communication. Then it's completely unsurprising that the Nephilim show up in rom-coms or whatever in the 21st century.
I agree.
We should be utterly unsurprised by that. And further, I think part of the popularity is it's Christian adjacent. We live in a dominant Christian culture. The language we speak is a language of Christianity, of Bible. It's one of our Western civilization literary touchstones. It's obviously a religious one. And insofar as people can sort of keep one pinky finger holding onto the Bible, right, and then go and do something completely weird over here, it allows them to maintain a kind of touchstone to a text that they take to be at some level canonical, but then they kind of run wild with it from there, which is not unusual. The Book of Mormon does that. The rabbinical literature does that. We should not be surprised by it, because it's fundamentally not new. The Book of Watchers was that. It was them taking a line from Genesis and then building a whole fan fiction around it. And we're still making fan fiction today, and I think it should be utterly unsurprising that continues to go on. When Harry Potter hanging out with the Nephilim or whatever.
Right, agree. Yeah. Exactly.
So I think that we should never discount the fecundity of these myths. And if you want evidence for it, just look back to the 3rd century and what Mani was able to do with it.
Well said. And we are running a little bit low on time. I know, Dr. Sledge, you have to leave soon. Stephanie, did you have any other questions for Dr. Sledge before we go?
No, I didn't. I just wanted to thank him so much for sharing all of this information, because I did a little bit of reading myself to prepare for this, but as I don't as I said, I'm not, this is not my area, so I learned a lot today. I really appreciate that, so thank you.
And Stephanie,
Yeah.
I admire your work greatly, and so thank you. Keep putting out with the stuff you put out. It's amazing and wonderful. And Jason,
Thank
you as well.
you.
I'm sad to hear it's coming down to the end of the first season of your show. But I just want to, again,
Well,
from one educator to another, thank both of you for again doing I think, a uniquely difficult job, and I know it from experience, of being an outward-facing scholar who engages the public. That means we have to do the scholarship on the back end, but also make it engaging on the front end. That's a really difficult job, and again, my admiration for both of you for electing to do that.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you. Thank you. And the same I can say for you, for what you're doing. You're really helping people understand really complex concepts, ideas, and texts, etc. I think you're doing a great job too.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both, Justin. Thank you, Stephanie. Justin, you never know when season 2 June might be around the corner.
Sure.
So we'll see. I have some stuff, but I can't really talk about it yet. But I am working on season 2, so I will.
Wow, secret stuff. Great.
Yes, sir.
Yay.
But yeah, thank you both. I am, like I said, huge admirers of both of your work, and it was an honor, Stephanie, having you join us. And Justin, it's always
Thank
a pleasure,
you.
and I always learn something new whenever you come on. Now on, I will always think of the Nephilim as the incels of the third
Beavis and
century.
Butthead.
Yeah, the Beavis and
This
Butthead.
is Beavis and Butthead of the angels. I mean, I'm really not joking. I really think of them. Let's go have sex with girls. And they're like,
Yeah.
okay, you do it first. I'm like, all right,
Oh
guys.
my goodness.
Yeah, it
That
really
is
reminds me almost
great.
of like in the Nag Hammadi text, like Origin of the World or Reality of the Rulers. Like we think of these like these fallen entities as super badass, but like they're like huffing and puffing and they can't get Adam to stand up, and they're like arguing amongst themselves. Like, yeah, they're really made to look like bumbling idiots, like in a Fatty Arbuckle story or a Fatty
Right.
Arbuckle movie or something. So,
And you get names for them, right? Like that reflect Saklas, blind, stupid,
Right.
fool. I mean, they're these archons they get names like that. They don't get fierce names. Samael's pretty cool, like Poison of God, but they're typically like Saklas, blind. I mean, and so that they're not. I never think of them as terribly fearsome.
Absolutely. Well, Stephanie, did you want to plug your shows and your social media one more time before we go? Then just Dr. Sledge will get to you.
Yes, thank you. It's www.rejectedreligion.com. On social media, it's Rejected Religion. YouTube is also Rejected Religion. I'm going to be uploading a new interview with Sue Terry on my YouTube channel. She is the former director of the Magical Women Conference, and she started her own platform now called Owl House Seminars. Had a great discussion with her, and that interview is going to be coming soon. So hopefully you'll be able to have a look.
Awesome. And Dr. Sledge, we know you have some new merchandise. So the Patreon is popping right now.
Yeah.
The
The channel's doing well, but yeah, you can find me at Esoterica on YouTube. But aside from that, social media scares the devil out of me. The Nephilim hold nothing to the power of the algorithm. I'd rather deal with the Nephilim than deal with Facebook.
Right.
Love it. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank everyone for joining us, who's watching, who made comments. I really do enjoy the spontaneity of these lives. Sorry for the snafu at the beginning again.
No problem.
Stephanie, Justin, until next time, I really hope you will both join us again. This has been an absolute pleasure. This has been so much fun. And everyone watching, we will see you for Daniel Ogden at the end of April. Edward Watts. Got some good lives coming up, so hope to see you there.
Great.
And we will see you then. Until then, take care.
Bye. Have a good day.